Hey, this is Donna Druchunas with Procreate and Tech Tips for the Sequential Artist Workshop. And welcome. Today we're going to talk about textures, and we're going to start with a question that I got from someone in the Sequential Artist Workshop Mighty Network group. When does it matter if something gets pixelized? That's how I'm rephrasing the question. So this is the image that I got with the question. The question's about the brushes and what kind of pixelization you get. Now, looking at this image, which is 1200 by 1200, I'm going to open it. It's 1200 by 1200 pixels. So if you're printing at 300 dpi, you can look at this at 4 inches square would be the biggest it could be. I've got it bigger on my screen, but of course my screen is not 300 dpi. I don't know what the current screen resolution of my iPad is. I remember screens used to be 72, 96 dpi, stuff like that. So you can zoom in a lot more or make this a lot bigger without seeing pixelization. So it looks fine to me. So why is there a question? Well, let's zoom in on these brushes. Mono, this is the mono brush, and these are 2 brushes that are included with Procreate, the Monoline and the syrup brush. So the Monoline is got a smoother edge, and it says less pixelated here, but really what it is the edge is anti-aliased, which means that the software makes it smoother by including grayscale pixels around the edge. So we don't just have a sharp black edge at the end of the stroke. We have this fading out into gray. Because I've zoomed in so far, you're never going to look at this like that. You can't see it at all when it's at the regular size or even, zoomed in moderately. Now the syrup brush has much less of that. There's a little bit, but mostly it looks like a very hard edge. So it looks a little sharper when it's small. And this one looks a little blurrier or less sharp on the edge when it's small, which is the size you're going to be seeing at. So that this pixelization does not matter at all. It is not going to show up at the size that you print if you stay within the size that you're allowed for the size of the image. So here's an image I made that is 3000 by 3000 pixels, which means I could make it print at up to 10 inches with no problem, because 300 pixels per inch times 10 inches is 3000. That's what printing resolution normally is. Okay, now I can zoom in a lot further on this before I start seeing pixelization, because there's more pixels. That's all there is to it. There's more pixels there. So when I have this smaller, they're being smushed into a smaller area. So I have to zoom in further before I see those edges. In fact, it's almost impossible to zoom in enough to see it as much as I did on the other one. And that's just because there are more pixels in this image. And when I have them both set to the size of my iPad screen, there's more pixels squished into the size of my iPad screen with a 3000 pixel image than there is with the 1200. Now, let me just show you something really interesting. I'm going to turn this off so I have a blank canvas and add a new layer. And I'm going to go to my Monoline brush, and I've got it, well, let's pick a size. Let's pick a size, and I'm going to save that size by clicking the checkbox there, so that way I can show you this in the other document as well. So here is how that brush writes at this size, which is 42%. And now let's go to the syrup brush, and I have some sizes saved before. I had some sizes I used before, 14 and 72%. But let's try to find something like 42%, so we both have both brushes at the same percent, which has nothing to do with anything. 41, close enough. Has nothing to do with anything of how fat the pen will write, because it depends on how the brush is created. But there are my 2 lines at 42% in 3000 pixel square. So you can see how thick they come out. The thickness of the brush is related to the the size of the canvas. So if I turn off that layer, make a new layer here, and start with the syrup brush, when I do it at 42%, it's much bigger than it was in my other one. And if I go to Monoline, it's much bigger as well. And that's because this is actually a much smaller canvas. If I were to make it kind of proportional to, say, the other one had 3,000 pixels and it filled from top to bottom, and this one has 1,200 pixels, so from top to bottom there would fit 3 of them if it was the same. So this is really how big that image would be compared to the other one. So this is all relative based on how many pixels you have and how much space you put that into on your screen or when you print it. So you want to make sure that you keep it small enough. Don't zoom in, make it bigger for printing or for viewing on the screen, because that's when you see the stuff. If you want it to be bigger, make it bigger with more pixels in your canvas. So I hope that makes sense. Now let's look at my things I wanted to talk to about creating texture for effects on your drawings, on your comics and art. We're going to look at a few different ways to do this. We're going to look at brushes, paper, overlays, which is just it's similar to paper, but just adding texture to the whole screen instead of 2 small areas with a brush. And we're going to look at a feature on Procreate called adding noise that I use sometimes when something just looks a little too smooth for my taste, because I like my stuff to be kind of rough and almost hand-drawn looking. So what I've got here are several Procreate files that I'm going to show you. This first one is a class I did with Lisa Bardot using her gouache brushes. And it was a lesson where she was talking about painting as if you were painting on paper. And so this layer is my sketch that of what I was going to paint, and all of the painting and texture takes place on one layer. So there's only one layer there, and the texture that you see here is all coming from her gouache brushes. There's no texture in the document. When I turn that off, the background's totally plain white. So everything you see is on that one layer. So that's an interesting way to paint in Procreate, just like you're painting on paper. And you use brushes that have some texture in them. In that case, it was a tutorial for the gouache brushes. So I used the Gouache Textures. This is something I just made up. One day in my sketchbook stack, I do sketchbook stuff on my iPad, and I used a whole bunch of layers for this. That tends to be how I work. I'll do something on a layer and then add something else and add something else. And normally when I'm doing people, I draw their face first. So this was probably the first layer I doodled on here, and I am using some brushes that you can see has texture in it. What brushes was I using? Probably Lisa Bardot's Artist Pastels. I love the pastel brushes and crayon brushes that have these kind of textures. So that's probably what I was using on this, but I didn't make any notes. And then I just added layers with different things. I wanted the background not to be white, and I didn't use the background color. I just added a layer and put the color in. I never used the background color very much. I don't know why. I just put in a layer if I want a solid color and fill it with the color. Then I wanted an overall texture, and this is actually a photograph. And if I set the stuff to normal and full opacity, you can see this was a photograph of a honeycomb that I took and put in my document, and I filled the panel with it, and then I changed it to multiply and lowered the opacity to make a texture in my background. And I didn't want that to be everywhere, so I added some lines because I was thinking, what was I thinking? Honeycomb, bees. So that's what I was thinking when I drew that background. And again, I used one of those pastel brushes that has the texture built right in the brush. So that was what I did in my background. And I had my face and my hair, and I filled in like I added a little body and I made a whole shape. I just outlined the whole shape, like I do sort of with the flats when I showed in the color video, except I used a texture brush on this, so it's not totally solid, but I colored in the whole shape. And then I, with that shape, if we look at our layers in the stack from the bottom up, when I put that shape on, it covered up the honeycomb image, and the stripe also covered the honeycomb image. So I added the honeycomb image back in as another layer. So I added in as a whole nother layer. I set it to multiply mode, and then I only wanted it to show in the flat shape. So I chose clipping mask. When I selected the layer and the menu came up, I chose clipping mask, which means that now this honeycomb only shows inside the shape of the layer below it. Then I wanted to kind of make that less bold and add an outline to my image, so I did that and lowered the opacity, and I had my other layers. So as you can see here, it's sort of like that painting one in that I have, you know, different brushes and just painted on it, but I did them on all different layers. There's no specific logic to the way I arrange the layers. I just, you know, some things I wanted in the background, like the stripes, and some things are the characters, so they're in the foreground, but other than that, I just built it up as I went and made it up as I went. So you can do all different layers for your textures. This is another drawing I just finished for a project I'm working on, and I also did a whole bunch of layers in here. And some of them are texture, like even in the background, I added some textures like that. I did this with regular flatting, whereas I put in just whole flat color for the character. And then I added some textures and colors and things on top of that, a whole bunch of them actually. I just kept adding and adding. And this is like mixed media to me. You just keep adding and adding textures. So go all the way back to having the layers on, how I did it. Again, I just do it like mixed media and like, oh, this is a little too bland, so I'm going to add a texture over the whole document because I wanted to look more grungy. So I put this layer over the whole thing, and this one is like shadows and the texture just on the wool that this lady's spinning. And then I added some more texture to that on another layer. Yeah, so I just built it up like mixed media, how I do when I'm doing mixed media, which is just add stuff on top, on top, on top. No plan, I just keep going. The nice thing about doing it on the iPad is you can turn off something, or you can delete something, or you can undo, which you can't do on real mixed media. You just have to keep building up more layers. So how did we do some of these things? Okay, so we can use brushes and brush stamps for textures. These are a bunch that are included in Procreate. And most of these, well, some of these are nice textures, and some of these look like, you know, like old wallpaper or something. But there's all kinds of uses for them. And if you go in your brushes and find the folder that says texture, and for me it's way down here because I moved mine around, it comes with some in it, and I happen to add a bunch more textures into my folder. But here are some of the ones that we saw in that document that we're in. And whoops, I'm on a hidden layer. Let me add a new layer to draw on. And I can just paint as if it's wallpaper. I can just paint with these various textures. There's a wood grain one if you want paneling, you know, striped wallpaper. And I don't remember which one of these came with Procreate, but you can tell because the ones that don't come with Procreate have the little symbol on them like you added them, the same symbol that's in the menu of brushes. The ones that have the little tilde shape are ones that I added, and the ones that have regular icons or nothing in this part of the brush window are ones that came with Procreate. So I can see this Signet one came with Procreate, and I can, oh, that's way too small, it's like a line, but if I make it really big, I can just paint a whole texture. Let's clear that layer by 3-finger swiping back and forth, and I'll just show you that one brush by itself. See, I can tap around or drag it around, and there I've just made a whole texture on the whole document, which can be my background layer. I could add another layer on top of that, go to other brushes. I'm going back to the ones I use all the time, pick my dry ink, and then start drawing a monster or something. So there we have using the texture brushes. Now, of course, there are tons of them that are in Procreate and tons that are not. So this is a bunch of ones that are in Procreate. These are all brushes that are in Procreate in different places. So you can look for them, you know, artist crayons, sassafras, hearts, Taralea. I love the Taralea brush. All different ones that you can try, and you can make them really big and try filling in your whole background with them. So there are tons that come with Procreate, so you don't have to get any new brushes if you want. These are the artistic brushes, the ones that are in the artistic folder on Procreate. These are a lot of neat ones for textures. I didn't write down what they are, but I just painted with them in the order they were in the menu. But again, in the artistic folder, lots of neat textures you can use for backgrounds or other things. It's not just for backgrounds. There's a bunch of brushes called All-Star that Procreate has put out earlier in the year that was free, and it has all these different neat brushes in them, from like a watercolor to glitter and some different textury ones. Procreate puts out brushes every now and then, and these are features from what it calls All-Star Brush Makers. They're people that make and sell brushes, and they made one brush for Procreate to give in this freebie bundle. So you can Google that if you want to see these brushes. They're really fun to play with. And then I have this lino cut set that I got, I think, from a Skillshare class, and it's got a lot of, or at least several brushes that are made to be paper backgrounds for when you do lino cuts, but of course you can use them for whatever you want. So where do I have that? Somewhere down here with my inking and things in my Logic. That makes sense. Is this lino cut set of brushes that I got, and let's make a clean layer here. Turn that off, and show you how some of these work. So here's lino print paper, it's called. It's really dark, but I could cover a whole canvas. As long as I don't pick it up my pencil, I can cover the whole canvas with it. When it overlaps so it gets darker, you can see that. But I don't have to leave it like that. I can change the opacity of the brush to paint with, or I can change the opacity of the layer after I paint with it. So that's one brush from that group. I tend to like lighter ones, like that are just lighter to begin with. And if I wanted to do a whole background, I would make the brush as big as I could, because then I can just go like that, and there I have the whole paper covered in one little motion. And then there's one called Spots, adds like dirty texture. So things like that you can use, and there's tons of them on the internet, free and pay. And I wanted to show you something here. I put in this little picture of a cow, and it's just flatted. It's just flat color, yellow and black, and there's nothing in the white area. So if I could turn my background off, you can see there's no white paint in there. It's just nothing. But if I turn these on, it changes the whole look of my drawing from this flat thing to this really textured thing. And so you can use these brushes to paint a background and texture your drawing that way. However, you can also use them, any of the texture brushes, not just these paper ones, any brush that's a texture brush. So here's some pastel brushes I got. I can set them to whatever size I want, and now I want a brown cow. So I can make a layer underneath this one. I made it underneath because remember the cow is transparent. This is solid gold, solid black, but the cow has no color in it. So if I color underneath that layer, it'll color the cow. And I can use that brush to color in my cow. Now I'm not actually staying within the lines of my cow. What's happening is this layer is covering it. So I kind of went in there and filled it in. I can change my colors, I can change my brushes, and I can work on the same layer or add another layer. Let's make that brush smaller. And I can change the color and texture of different parts of my cow. I can do that over and over again with whatever colors and things I want, and I can use it big, make it smaller. I can use it to make shadows and highlights and, you know, all kinds of things just by using these texture brushes for painting. Now, in my case here, I did not do any flat color on the cow underneath what I'm doing with this texture brushes, so the white of the paper shows through. If I had done a flats layer, let's just do that now like I did in the other color video. So let's turn these off, and here's my cow, and there's my drawing. And let's say I wanted to do a flats layer. I would go back to my brushes and pick my flatting round brush. That's the one I like to use for flatting. And I could just go outline the whole cow. In this case, I'm only going to outline half the cow because I just want to show you. So I could outline that cow, fill it in with color. So now I have like a half of a flatted cow. And when I turn my other color layers back on, you can see the difference. This one has no flat color on it. The white of the paper shows. This one, the color of the flatting layer shows through. So you can layer these things on top of flat colors, on top of a clean page, whatever you want, and just color with them and draw with them like you're painting or coloring. That can be done with texture, not just a solid color. You know, so here's my full size one here, and I've separated the background and the cow. So let me move the yellow background behind the cow. Now let's say I just wanted to texturize that. I could go above that. I could pick a color and texture, whatever I wanted. I'll go back to my texture brushes and pick one of these paper ones that I saved, make it really big, and I can color like that, and I'm adding some texture to it. Now, it's showed on my cow too. Why? Because my cow is only an outline. Again, turn off the background. My cow is only an outline. My cow is not colored in. But this area was filled with a solid color by going to the outline area and selecting automatic, and then coming to a new layer. So I selected the background of that with automatic, and it selected the yellow area, what is yellow area here, but really it just selected what's outside the lines of my drawing because my lines are solid and closed shapes. So now when I go to a new layer, I can say fill the layer, and I've made a different background color, right? So we can pick whichever one we want. But here we've got this texture that is going into the cow, and we only want it on the background. So I'm going to stick with my yellow background layer, and I'm going to delete the green one I made. Then I'm going to take this layer with the texture that I did all over. It's right above my yellow layer, and I'm going to go into the menu and say clipping mask. Now this texture only shows where there is paint on the yellow layer. It disappears inside the cow. So that's just another way to use a clipping mask combined with having a a shape for your background where you don't want the texture to go on the whole thing, just on the background. Now I can create layers above that and color on my cow however I want as well. So all these things can be combined. Basically, it's just painting with the brushes, and of course we wouldn't want to use the same brush for painting our cow. I'm going to use block letter texture brush that I have, and I can again go say I want a brown cow, can make the brush as big as I want, and I can, you know, add texture. Now this brush, you'll notice that it's not coloring smoothly. It's made for lettering, so it's made to smooth out the shapes as you go, but it doesn't work good for coloring because it's doing that. So what you want to do, if that happens to you, is go into your brush, click on it again to open the menu, and look at stabilization. Remember, we talked about this with other lessons. See, the streamline is all the way up on this, which makes the brush smooth out the lines. You don't want that when you're coloring, so you can turn that off, and then you can just color with it, and it doesn't smooth out the lines at all. And you can do that less and more, however you want. So streamline is something you can change in brushes whenever you want. Now if I want to color with this brush, you can see it just goes where I'm going, and I can easily color with it and fill in my shape with the texture. So streamline is important to know in your brushes when you're messing around with painting with textures. Okay, so that's using brushes. You can use brushes to paint the whole page. You can use brushes to just paint your picture. This is an image I did from an exercise from a book I had on colors. It wasn't about Procreate. It was just about, I think it was called Color Lab, the book. And I was using the exercise in these to practice in Procreate. And so I did lots of stuff with textures in this one, but the one that I wanted to show you here is paper. I added a paper texture. And I showed this last week in the lesson on mixed media in Procreate and combining things. So I drew this. I drew the shapes. I drew it for shapes. I had a sketch. If I just click and hold the check, it makes only one layer show. So my sketch is on multiply and really transparent. So I made this sketch from this photo, and then I went to paint it. And so this is the first layer I painted, was just my like kind of flat colors. And then I added textures for the brush, and you can see that I didn't finish. I didn't add any textures to those two. Just to some of them, I added some textures. And I didn't finish working on this exercise. And I added shadows and some speckles and a background color with the texture brush, different textures in the background. But the thing that makes it look the most textury overall is the paper. And what I did was I inserted a watercolor texture paper. It's a picture that someone took of a piece of watercolor paper. Let's turn on only that layer and set it to normal and full opacity. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but there's crinkles and shadows in it of the watercolor paper. I filled my whole canvas with it, and I set it to color burn. And you can't see anything when that's done because I've turned off all the other layers. It only shows up when you have something there. And I didn't quite like it enough. It made a little difference, so I made a copy of that layer and I sent it to linear burn, and with both of those on, it makes a really dark watercolor texture. So what you can do is put in a picture of watercolor paper or any kind of paper or texture and mess around with the layer modes, layer blend modes. Usually for paper you want to go above normal, which are the darker blend modes. Linear burn and color burn and multiply are the ones I use most for this. And just mess around with them, changing the multiply the blend mode, multiply, darker, color burn, etc. Again, I don't usually use the lighter ones because they kind of erase your art in many ways. I usually use the darker ones for the paper, but you can try anything you want. And you can try 1 or 2 layers of the same watercolor texture or different texture paper and set different blend modes, and it adds a texture to your whole document. And again, I find those on Googling, there's all kinds of free and paid ones. Here's another watercolor texture I got somewhere on Google, and it's more blotchy and darker in some areas than the one I used in the sample I just showed you. So this does cool effects. This is a paper that I forgot what it's called. I think I locked up my Procreate. Let's get rid of it and restart it. This is a cool gray pastel paper. This might be from Lisa Bardot. You can see it's got some texture in it. So when you draw over that, this one was suggested that you just draw over it with texture brushes. So you don't set it to a blend mode or anything. You put it on the bottom of your document stack of layers instead of on the top, and you just pick your colors and your texture brushes and you paint on top of it, and that texture shows through. And also you can change your painting layers to multiply or make them not fully opaque if you want to keep them on normal to keep the color more consistent with what you're choosing from your palette. And you can paint on top of that and it shows through. So there's all different ways to do this. I really just suggest you spend a lot of time playing with stuff and randomly look up classes on YouTube or sign up for Skillshare or Google, get a 2-week freebie trial on Skillshare and watch some classes. These are 2 other texture papers I got somewhere. And I used them on my cow image to add color and texture. So let me show you what I did that. First thing, I put in the cow image. I added the texture of this grungy paper. And I just took my transform tool, and I stretched it to fill the whole page. And then I changed it to linear burn, but you could try all different ones. Like I said, the light ones below normal in the list usually kind of erase stuff. Sometimes it can be really cool. And if you go all the way down the list, you find these ones that reverse the colors, which also can be kind of cool and do interesting things. But I'm going to use linear burn again for this. I use that a lot. I'm going to leave the max opacity because I like how that looks. So that covered my whole image. Then I put my other one in and put it over the whole image. It's set to normal with 80% opacity. And so it blocked out my black lines and things, and I didn't want it to do that. I just wanted to make this texture go inside the cow. So I made a layer mask. I only want this texture to go inside the black lines on the cow. So I'm going to delete my layer mask. I'm going to show you how I made it. I went to this layer, which is locked. It's my cow layer. And I'm turning off the other one so you can see what I'm doing. I went to my selection tool on automatic, and I only wanted this to come inside the cow, not on the black lines, not in the background. So on my automatic selection tool, I am just selecting, whoops, got the outline, didn't want it, undo. Just selecting inside the cow, the white areas. Okay, now I'm going to turn on that area, that texture. I still have my selection active. You can see the S is there and the lines are still there showing what's not selected. And I can go to this and say mask. That's a different way to use a mask. So basically what happened is I selected something, I went to my layer and I said add mask. Not clipping mask, just mask. And what that mask does is it says whatever's selected, that's where this layer is going to show. It's going to show up in what's selected. Everything else is going to be erased. But it's not erased permanently because I can turn off the mask and turn it back on. So when you make a mask, whatever is selected is what will show. So now I have my cow, my texture, turn off my selection, my texture that's over the whole thing, so you can see it texturizes the background and the cow, and then I added this texture that only is inside the cow, not in the background, not over the layers. Okay, I'm just going to simplify things here and re-show you how to do that mask with drawing a simple circle and just show what we're doing. So I need a new layer and I'm going to draw a circle, and now I'm going to turn on my main texture layer that I had covering the whole thing. I don't want it to cover the whole thing anymore. I'm only working with the circle and the texture. I want the texture to be only outside the circle. So I'm going to take my selection tool on automatic and select outside the circle. Then when I go to my texture, I have the outside of the circle still selected. I didn't unselect it. I left that selection, go to another layer and say mask. Uh-oh, what happened? My mask layer is not turned on. I don't know why, so I'm going to turn it on. Okay, always check all these little details when you're doing things, so don't panic that it didn't work. Okay, so remember, on this, I went to this layer, I selected the outside, I went to the texture layer and selected mask. So it only shows on the outside because that's what I had selected. So we would delete the mask, go back to seeing only this layer, take my selection tool on automatic again. This time I selected inside the circle. I go back to my texture layer. Remember, I selected inside the circle, and when I say mask, it only shows up inside the circle. So the mask in that way shows on whatever you had selected. I'm going to delete it one more time. Go back to these two layers. It doesn't have to be a shape you already draw. You can make any selection. Let's pick the freehand selection tool. You can make any crazy selection you want and go to that texture layer and say mask, and it will only show up inside the selection. So you can kind of draw with that by putting the texture on and then making a shape and having it only inside that. So I hope that helps you figure out a little bit what this mask feature does. Basically, whenever you apply a mask is a selection. Whenever you make a selection and go to a layer and select mask from the menu, that selection becomes a mask. Mask is basically a selection, and everything outside the selection disappears. So watch that over again if you need more tips on that. So that's basically what I had for textures. I mostly use paper and brushes for my textures, but there are other kinds of things you can use as well. I just have one last thing I want to show you. We can leave this. I just want to show you one last thing. So say I don't want my lines to be so solid on my cow. My cow lines are really solid black, and they're a little grungy because of the brush I used, but I want to make my lines grungier. How can I do that without drawing the cow over again? This is a kind of cool thing. In the Effects Adjustments menu with the little magic wand, there's a thing called noise. And you can add noise by having a layer selected in your list, my lines, clicking the adjustments menu and noise, and then dragging your pencil back and forth to add more or less noise. See how it's grunging up my black lines? And then it has all different like little kinds of features. It's all just adding like blurry, textury, grungy things to it, but you can change the scale of them, octaves, I don't know exactly what that means. Just mess around with all. Turbulence is how like messy it is, and there's different shapes of noise. So that's something you can do. Now my cow outlines are textured. If I turn all my other layers back on, I don't have a solid black outline, I have this textury outline. So noise is a cool thing to play with just for adding texture to whatever layer was selected. The only thing is, noise is always black and white. So if I have this color layer selected and I pick adjustments noise, the more noise I add, the less color shows because the noise is added in black. It still can be kind of cool. It still can be color and textury. If I don't drag it all the way up with my pencil. Dragging the pencil back and forth across the canvas makes the noise get more or less intense. So you can play with that, with the scale, with the octaves. Octave seems to be kind of a brightness thing. Turbulence, see there, that almost looks like giraffe spots and gets more goofy the further I bring up the turbulence. So it's another way to add texture. Okay, so recap, we looked at texture using brushes, using paper, what I call overlays, which is just adding other layers of texture over the whole document and changing the blending mode, and noise. So hope that was useful and fun for you, and you'll play with textures and papers and different things, and Google for textured brushes, Google for Procreate paper textures. Really, they're nothing special for Procreate. Some of them are pre-set up for you, but they're just images that are basically photos of papers or some grungy texture that someone made. It could be a photo of marble, photo of wood, or just a painting that someone made, of abstract painting that's used as a texture. So have fun, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.